Humaley and this is Floral Art Review, and you can see that today I'm in my winter woolies because it's wet and raining and cold outside, and so I thought I'd take this opportunity to revisit a design of mine from a couple of years back. This is a design that I was very unhappy with in terms of the result because it actually got disqualified from the competition, and I have had difficulty in reviewing it and looking back at it because I was bitterly disappointed at the time. I felt that it was, the reason given was quite unjust. But that said, judge's decision is always final, so let's see now what an independent eye can tell me about this design, because I really have struggled to try and think of how I could do anything differently. The title was inspired by a fashion magazine cover, and my very first difficulty in planning the design was finding a fashion magazine, not something that's as prevalent as they used to be in terms of going to a newsagent and just picking one up, buying one. I tried charity stores and couldn't find anything in those either. Eventually found more like what was a sewing magazine that had fashion in it through the ages, as you can see. And so I tore that up and used the pages as the base. Underneath the magazine pages is a timber base, and so they're glued down to the timber base, screwed into the timber base as some heavy-duty wires that I can bend into shapes. The wires are wrapped in a multicoloured wool, so it's purple through to the maroon colours in the wool. And around the wire supports that I've bent, I've made pencils so that the wrapped wire coming out of them looked like it was a drawing. So it was just the sketching of the fashion design. So there are some actual pencils around one of the supports and some laying across the bottom of the base. The others, the larger ones, are actually paper roll cardboard tubes. So one's toilet paper, one's a paper hand towel tube covered in crepe paper. And the top, where you would normally sharpen the pencil, is actually made with corks, so shaved cork from a bottle to give that same impression of the pencil look to it. The plant material that I've used, they're suspended in test tubes. The chrysanthemums, the lighter ones are what's known here as a Chinese ground orchid, and then I've put some grapes in as well for the colour combination and also for a change in the texture, because there wasn't really anything apart from the pages that was shiny or glossy. So that was my entry into the competition, and as I said, I was very disappointed when I found that it hadn't been judged, because the judge interpreted the title as inspired by a fashion magazine cover, and I had used more than one cover in the base of the design. My contention, I didn't argue with the judge, but my contention is that any one of those could have been the inspiration, that there were lots of them there, but I was inspired by one in particular because of the colours that I used. But that's neither here nor there now. I have to be very careful with this particular judge and this particular competition to ensure that I read the title very carefully and know that it is going to be judged on absolutely every single word in the title. So let's see now what an independent assessment of this design, based on the principles and elements of design, can tell me about what is right and what I should do to improve the title. To improve the interpretation, I should say. See, I'm still at odds with it. Let's see what it says. An overall view, first of all, this inventive and lively tabletop design channels fashion magazine aesthetics through bold colour blocking, expressive structure and multimedia layering. So all of the things that I talked about, I wanted it to be the bold colours that were a reflection of the colours that were in one of those magazine pages that I've used at the base. With visual cues from the 1950s and 60s fashion editorial, the piece achieves a pop art sensibility while showcasing clever craftsmanship and floral integration. So again, an acknowledgement of making the pencils, but incorporating the flowers into the whole of the design. Balance. Asymmetrical balance is well achieved through the triangular stance of the coloured verticals, the wrapped pencils, and the branching floral extensions. The grouping of magazine covers at the base adds visual grounding, though some pieces appear unanchored or loosely paced, slightly affecting the balance. And that's probably true. If I look now at that image, there's too much in the base. The base is really quite overwhelming, and I need to think about tidying that up because it's competing with the actual design that it is placed underneath. So there's a conflict there, and that, to me, creates a bit of imbalance. So I'm certainly going to rethink that part of it. Proportion and scale. Proportions are generally appropriate for a tabletop exhibit. Vertical height is modest but effective relative to base area and the supporting concept. So, and I think that's another thing that the magazines at the base give you the impression of a wider base, and so I probably should have gone somewhat taller than I have, just to give it that ratio, the proportion that is better visually for us. The pencil wrap columns echo fashion accessories or editorial elements, harmonising scale with theme. So what it's saying there is that I have, by grading the sizes of those pseudo pencils and the actual pencils, is incorporated that idea using the scale into the design itself. Rhythm and movement. Dynamic rhythm is generated by curved yarn or pipe forms interconnecting the verticals and leading the eye in loops and sways. So that's the wrapped wire that I've got there. The diagonal floral placements also create a fashion runaway style motion with upward reaching energy and playfulness. So that's the orchids, because they go in any direction. It's given it a little bit of airiness, a bit of lightness, and certainly lots of movement. And the rhythm part of it is the repetition of those particular placements, so that you can see that they're that area at the top, whilst it's moving and playful, it's still the same plant material that's used across that area. Shouldn't wave my hand in front of the camera so much. Dominance. The use of magenta and purple establishes strong chromatic dominance. The large chrysanthemums are focal, but the eye competes with the busy text and varied base materials. A clearer floral focal point would enhance hierarchy, and that, I think, is very true. I think that's the one thing that lets this design down in terms of the principles and elements of design, is that base is just too busy. You know, if I took out all of the pages and just had them almost covered apart from the one that gave me the colour inspiration, it would be so much cleaner a design. Still give the appearance of movement and the boldness of it, but less would your eye be drawn to that base and be confused by the base. Unity and harmony. Unity is moderately successful. The repetition of yarn, texture, colour and circular forms brings cohesion. However, the base layer of magazines, while conceptually clever, introduces visual noise that slightly reduces harmony unless carefully curated or framed. And that's very true. And I can see that now, and I know that had I been judged in this, I would have lost a lot of points for it. And so I probably wouldn't have been placed particularly highly because of that clutter across the base. Colour. Bold and on theme, echoing editorial makeup, textiles and retro palettes. So that's what's reflected in the magazines at the base. The interplay of hot pinks, purples and turquoise reflects stylised magazine visuals. So again, what's being shown in the pages underneath it. Inclusion of natural green, for example foliage, might soften the intensity and add freshness. That is, it's an interesting suggestion. I hadn't really thought of putting any green in because I felt like it was adding another colour that wasn't really reflected out of the magazine covers that were there. So I would look at that, but I would look at it in terms of probably not having a flat or a bold or a glossy foliage inclusion, but more like a fern, something that's a little bit more airy, just to, and perhaps through that top where the orchids are, just to maintain that lightness in the design, but give it some freshness, as it said. Line. Strong use of curvilinear lines, yarn, flower stems creates dynamic contrast with the verticals, which are the pencils. A more defined vertical anchor could improve clarity in structure. I guess that's probably true, but I would like to see decluttering of the base and to see whether that then makes those pencil forms strong enough to be the vertical anchor for the design. Texture, excellent textural contrast, smooth magazine paper, soft wool yarn, spiky chrysanthemums and glossy grapes. Very tactile and editorial, almost collage-like. I guess it is collage-like, not in terms of what we would normally see in floral art, where we like to have things massed together for collages. But I'm happy with the textural contrast. I do think I needed the grapes to add that glossiness. I don't think there's enough smoothness that comes off the paper, or the glossiness that comes off the paper to enhance the smooth part of the texture groupings. Form. Overall form is a deconstructed triangle which suits the avant-garde fashion-forward concept. Okay. Some elements feel slightly ad hoc, for example the grapes, and would benefit from a more refined compositional role or intentional grouping. I think that's true too. I think that I chose the grapes because they were within the colour palette and they gave me the texture that I was looking for in the design, but I haven't really thought out their placement as well as I could have done. So I would look at that again. I would probably still use the grapes, but I would use them in a different way so that they were something more of a feature or had a story that followed through in the design. Space. Adequate use of negative space between structures keeps the central area open. Floral placement might be pulled back slightly from magazine base to avoid clutter. That's very true. We've talked about that all the way through, that the magazines need to be readjusted down the bottom. And I think where it says adequate use of negative space, it's probably a little bit too cluttered. It's a bit hard to see because the backing is a textured timber backing on the wall behind it. There was a reasonable amount of space in it, but I think there could be more in terms of negative space. I think it just gets a bit too blocked in the centre of the design, but I'm really struggling with that magazine base now, so everything's affecting my view on that. So let's look now at some suggestions on what we can do, things that perhaps we've already talked about on the way through. Clarify the focal area. Choose one chrysanthemums or floral group to dominate, supporting it with lines and lighter textures around it to ensure focus. So that's, I think, had I brought the chrysanthemums into one section, it would have been better. I've tried to group them somewhat along the lines of where I've looped the wrapped wire, but it's not working as well as it should do. Refine the base composition. Consider mounting or partially layering the magazine covers in a more structured or collaged format to reduce visual clutter and strengthen thematic unity. And that is very true. That's probably the first thing I would do, is lose a whole lot of that base and bring it back down to a much cleaner, simpler base that was then colour-wise reflected in the design above it. Lift and isolate the grapes. If grapes are a metaphor for a luxury and indulgence, give them greater prominence or abstract their use, contained in a mesh or forming a stylized accessory. As is, they feel out of place. That's very true. So I'd have to think a bit more about, so perhaps maybe I could have the grapes as a central part and have them as the focal area and just have the flowers in between them. I'd need to use small flowers. Very much something I'd have to play around with and think about in terms of the space that's being used and the focal areas that then creates by doing it that way. Contrast and accent. Introducing a small accent colour such as a neon orange or a metallic could increase visual impact and echo bold magazine layouts. That's echoing the layouts that are underneath it. I think that would probably be the last thing I'd try. I would like to try a whole lot of other things first that we've talked about on the way through, the cleaning up the base, making the chrysanthemums more of a focal area, looking at how the grapes fit in with the story, putting in some some ferny, fresh foliage, all of those things I'd probably try before I introduced any other colour to this particular design. So overall, let me see what it says. This is a highly creative, conceptually rich design that effectively interprets the title through colour, material and playful references. It demonstrates strong artistic thinking, particularly in the integration of media and florals, with some refinement to spatial control and focal emphasis. It could evolve from expressive to editorially polished, very much in keeping with fashion-forward energy. So it's a good overall summary, and there's some very good suggestions. So there we have an independent analysis of a design that I struggled to review myself because I was so disappointed in how it had been assessed. If you're in that position, if you've got a design that you feel should have done better, but you don't really know what to do with it, or it distresses you to look at it again, hop over to the website, upload your image, and within about 24 hours you'll have your DesignEye assessment analysis back to you. A human judge will look at it as well to make sure that what it's saying is going to make sense to you in your floral art journey. I encourage you to use this as a resource for your floral art education. And I'll leave it there for this week. I'm Kimberly, and this is Floral Art Review.